Hyperspace jump completed. Approaching the planet of New Texas now. ETA minus 3 minutes.
Excellent. Computer scan for star peak.
Scanning. But fortunately, I don't have to try.
Ashamed. Tell someone you trust, like your parents, your doctor, your teacher, your minister or rabbi. Right, guys?
Right on.
Remember Saturday mornings in 1987? You're sitting cross-legged in front of the TV with a bowl of cereal, and suddenly, this cowboy marshal pulls out spiritual animal powers in the middle of space. That was Bravestar, and let me tell you, this show was absolutely insane in the best way possible. But here's the thing, most people have no idea just how wild the story behind this cartoon actually gets. See, Bravestar wasn't just another cartoon trying to sell toys. This was Filmation's last stand. Their final swing for the fences before the whole studio came crashing down. And man, what a swing it was. We're talking about a show that mixed cowboys with sci-fi, threw in Native American mysticism, tackled a drug epidemic storyline that made parents lose their minds, and somehow managed to pioneer CGI animation techniques that nobody else was doing in 1987. But here's what's crazy. Despite all that innovation, despite being technically groundbreaking, Bravestar became one of the biggest commercial failures in toy history. And the reasons why? They're way more interesting than you'd think. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the complete rise and fall of Bravestar. We'll cover how Filmation went from the success of He-Man to betting everything on a space cowboy, the insane production techniques they used, why the toys bombed so spectacularly, and how the whole thing ended with a studio shutdown and a mysterious sale that still has people asking questions today. And stick around because I'm going to tell you about some lost media from this show that most fans have never even heard about. Trust me, this story gets wild. The Genesis. Alright, so let's set the stage. It's 1987, and Filmation Associates is riding high off He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. That show was a cultural phenomenon. I mean, if you were a kid in the early 80s, you either had a Castle Grayskull or you wanted one for Christmas. Filmation had figured out the formula. Make a cartoon, sell the toys, print money. But here's where it gets interesting. The guys behind Bravestar, Lou Scheimer and Norm Prescott, they didn't just want to copy He-Man. They wanted to do something different, something that combined all their favorite genres into one show. And their inspiration? Ghostbusters. Now, I'm not talking about the movie. I'm talking about Filmation's own live-action Ghostbusters show from the 70s. That show had proven you could mix genres and make it work. So they thought, what if we take the Western genre, which, let's be honest, was pretty much dead by the late 80s, and we slam it together with science fiction? And that's how we got New Texas, the most bonkers setting in cartoon history. Picture this. It's the 23rd century. There's this planet called New Texas in the middle of nowhere, and it's basically the Wild West, but in space. We're talking about a frontier mining colony where people are literally digging up a mineral called carium, which is basically space gold that's worth more than anything in the galaxy. Now, the genius of this setup is that it gave them an excuse to have everything. You've got cowboys and sheriffs, sure, but you've also got aliens, robots, hoverbikes, laser weapons, and ancient mystical powers all existing in the same place. It's like someone threw Red Dead Redemption, Star Wars, and a Native American Vision Quest into a blender. The planet itself was divided into these key locations. You had Fort Carium, which was the main settlement. Think of it as Dodge City, but with force fields. Then there was Star Peak, this massive mountain where Bravestar would go to commune with his mentor, Shaman. There was the Hexagon, which was basically the villain's evil lair, and scattered around were all these different alien settlements and indigenous populations. But let's talk about what made this show really stand out. The characters and their absolutely ridiculous powers. Marshal Bravestar himself was a galactic marshal, basically a space Texas Ranger, and he had these 4 animal totems he could call on. And I'm not talking about subtle powers here. When Bravestar needed strength, he'd yell strength of the bear, and suddenly he could lift boulders, speed of the puma, and he's running faster than vehicles. Eyes of the hawk gave him supervision, and ears of the wolf gave him enhanced hearing. The show would literally stop. He'd strike a pose and announce which power he was using. It was gloriously over the top, and as a kid, you absolutely loved it. But here's what's really cool. Bravestar wasn't just some muscle-bound hero. The character was thoughtful, spiritual, and actually tried to solve problems without violence first. He was raised by the shaman, this mystical mentor who taught him to respect all life and use his powers responsibly. That was pretty progressive for an action cartoon in the 80s. Then you had 3030, and oh man, this character was something else. He was an equestroid, which is exactly what it sounds like, a robot horse that could transform into a bipedal form and use weapons. His name came from the fact that he carried a Sarah Jane, a transforming rifle that could switch between a standard gun and a more powerful mode. And he had this great gruff voice, and would constantly get into arguments with Bravestar about the best way to handle situations. The dynamic between Bravestar and 3030 was genuinely good. It wasn't just hero and sidekick. They were partners who respected each other, but didn't always agree. That's solid character writing. Now, every good hero needs a great villain. And Bravestar had Tex Hex. Tex Hex was a former prospector who got corrupted by this demonic entity called Stampede. The show's backstory revealed that Tex Hex used to be a regular guy until greed consumed him, and Stampede, who was basically the devil of New Texas, transformed him into this skeletal, undead outlaw with magical powers. And Tex Hex wasn't alone. He had the Carrion Bunch, this gang of outlaws that included characters like Sandstorm, who could control sand and dust storms, and Thunderstick, who wielded this powerful energy weapon. Each villain had their own gimmick, their own personality, and their own toy, because of course they did. But what made Tex Hex work as a villain was that he wasn't just evil for evil's sake. He was driven by greed and the corruption of Carrion mining. The show used him to explore themes about how the pursuit of wealth can destroy people and communities. Again, pretty heavy stuff for a cartoon that was supposed to sell action figures. The technical innovation. Alright, here's where things get really interesting from a production standpoint. Filmation was doing things with Bravestar that nobody else in television animation was doing in 1987. They were using 3 different animation techniques simultaneously. Traditional hand-drawn animation, rotoscoping, and, this is the big one, CGI. Now, when I say CGI, I don't mean Pixar-level stuff. This was 1987. But Filmation was using computer-generated imagery for vehicles, buildings, and complex mechanical movements. They called it their technical trinity, and it was genuinely groundbreaking for TV animation at the time. The rotoscoping gave the characters more realistic movement. They would film live actors and then trace over the footage. This made the action sequences feel more dynamic and fluid than your typical Saturday morning cartoon. And they were doing all of this on a television budget, which is insane when you think about it. Filmation was pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible in TV animation, trying to compete with the theatrical quality of movies while still producing 65 episodes. But here's where everything starts to go wrong. Because all of this innovation, all of this creative ambition, it was all in service of selling toys. That was the business model. And Filmation partnered with Mattel, the same company that had made He-Man toys a massive success. Except this time, something went horribly, catastrophically wrong. The beginning of the end. The Bravestar toy line launched, and it was a complete disaster. We're talking about one of the biggest toy failures of the 1980s. And there were 2 main reasons why. First, the scale problem. Mattel made the Bravestar figures in a different size than their other action figure lines. They weren't compatible with He-Man toys. They weren't compatible with G.I. Joe. They weren't compatible with anything. And in the 80s, that was a death sentence. Kids wanted toys that could all play together. If you had a Castle Grayskull and a G.I. Joe base, you wanted your action figures to be able to interact. Bravestar figures couldn't do that. It was a baffling decision. Mattel had just seen the success of the 3.75-inch G.I. Joe figures. They knew what worked, and then they went and made Bravestar figures a completely different size. It's like they learned nothing from the market. Second, the timing was off. There was a gap between when the cartoon premiered and when the toys hit stores. The show started building an audience. Kids got excited, and then the toys weren't available. By the time they finally showed up on shelves, the momentum was gone. Kids had moved on to other things. This timing discrepancy killed the toy line before it even had a chance. And in the cartoon toy business model of the 80s, if the toys don't sell, nothing else matters. But before we get to the fall, I need to talk about the price, because this episode is legendary for all the right and wrong reasons. In 1987, America was in the middle of the Just Say No anti-drug campaign. Nancy Reagan was on TV telling kids to refuse drugs, and there was this massive cultural push to address drug abuse. So Filmation decided to do an episode of Bravestar about drugs, and they didn't pull any punches. The Price featured a character who gets addicted to a drug and, spoiler alert, he dies. On screen. In a children's cartoon. They showed the consequences of drug use in a way that was shockingly direct for a Saturday morning show. Parents lost their minds. Some thought it was too intense for kids. Others praised it for tackling a serious issue. The episode became incredibly controversial, and it's still debated today. Was it appropriate? Was it effective? Did it traumatize a generation of kids? Looking back now, you can see what Filmation was trying to do. They wanted to use their platform to send a message, to be more than just a toy commercial. And whatever you think about the execution, you have to respect the ambition. They were trying to make Bravestar matter beyond just selling action figures. But here's the irony. All that ambition, all that risk-taking, couldn't save the show from the reality of the business. By early 1989, it was over. The toys had failed, the show's ratings weren't strong enough to justify the production costs, and Filmation was in serious financial trouble. On February 3rd, 1989, Filmation shut down. They had to file a WARN Act notice, which is what companies do when they're about to lay off a bunch of workers. Hundreds of people lost their jobs. An entire animation studio that had been producing cartoons since the 1960s, the studio that made He-Man, She-Ra, Fat Albert, and so many other shows, just ceased to exist. But here's where the story gets weird and kind of shady. The studio was acquired by a company called Paravision International, and Paravision was connected to L'Oreal, the cosmetics company. Yeah, you heard that correctly. The people who make makeup and shampoo bought an animation studio. Why? Nobody really knows for sure. The official story was that they wanted the intellectual property and the library of shows. But the whole thing was handled in this secretive way that left a lot of former Filmation employees bitter and confused. And then, to make matters worse, there were legal issues. The rights to Bravestar got tangled up in complicated ownership disputes. For years, you couldn't easily watch the show because nobody was quite sure who owned what. It became this weird orphaned property that fell through the cracks of entertainment history. And speaking of things falling through the cracks, let me tell you about the lost media. Filmation had plans for a second wave of Bravestar toys. They had designed new characters, new vehicles, new playsets. There were prototypes. There were designs. There were probably even some episodes written around these new toys. But when the first wave bombed, Wave 2 was canceled. All of that work just disappeared. Some prototype toys have surfaced over the years at collector conventions, selling for insane amounts of money, but most of it is just gone. There was also supposed to be a show called Bravo, which was going to be some kind of spin-off or related property. Almost nothing is known about it. It exists only as a footnote in production documents. And here's the thing that kills me. In the age of digital media, where everything is archived and preserved, Bravestar exists in this weird limbo. The show has been released on DVD, but the quality is inconsistent. Some episodes look great, others look like they were transferred from worn-out VHS tapes. There are technical discrepancies in the releases that suggest the original masters might be lost or damaged. For a show that was so technically innovative, it's tragic that we can't even watch it in the quality it deserves. The legacy. So, what's the legacy of Bravestar? What do we take away from this whole story? On one level, it's a cautionary tale about the cartoon toy industrial complex of the 1980s. It shows how even a good show with innovative production and genuine creative ambition could fail if the business side didn't work out. The toys had to sell, or nothing else mattered. But on another level, Bravestar represents something important in animation history. It was one of the last gasps of a certain era of television animation. The era where studios like Filmation could take risks, could try new techniques, could push boundaries. After Filmation shut down, the industry changed. animation increasingly moved overseas to cut costs. Studios became more risk-averse. The direct connection between cartoons and toy sales became even more cynical and calculated. Bravestar was trying to be more than just a commercial. It was trying to tell stories that mattered, to use animation techniques that were genuinely innovative, to create characters with depth and moral complexity. And it failed, at least commercially. But for those of us who watched it as kids, who remember Marshall Bravestar calling on the strength of the bear, who remember 3030's gruff loyalty, who remember being genuinely shocked by the Price episode, for us, it succeeded in ways that can't be measured in toy sales. The rise and fall of Bravestar is ultimately a story about ambition meeting reality. Filmation swung for the fences, tried to do something different, something innovative, something meaningful. And the market said, no thanks, we'll stick with what we know. But you know what? I'm glad they tried. I'm glad we got 65 episodes of a space cowboy with mystical powers fighting undead outlaws on a frontier planet. I'm glad we got a show that was willing to tackle serious issues and push technical boundaries. Even if it failed, even if it's been largely forgotten, it mattered. And hey, if you're feeling nostalgic for more deep dives into 80s cartoons that pushed boundaries and took risks, you need to check out my video on the complete history of Filmation's He-Man series. That show was the foundation for everything Bravestar tried to do, and the behind-the-scenes story is just as wild. I'll put that link right up here. I'll see you in the next one.